Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on where you are, what time you are listening to this or watching this. My name is Winston, and today is our very first guest for season two. I'm super excited to have him on, super excited that he agreed to be on, Mr. Vladimir Blagojevic. Vlad, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Awesome. Thanks for being on. So Vlad, before we actually get into the meat of this interview, just to speak some more about you. So you've held positions as account manager and you founded and co-founded several companies for the last couple of years. And I would even go as far as to say that, at least in my opinion, you are one of the top B2B marketing influencers on LinkedIn. Definitely a rising star on the platform, as a lot of people who are active there in that space will definitely see. And also today you are co-founder with Andre, who we had for this first season of fullfunnel.io.
That's right.
So before we even begin, I'd love for you to share a bit of your story, your background, starting out in your career to where it's led you today as co-founder of Full Funnel.
All right. So, very briefly, this is, I think, my third country where I live and my fourth career. And so I changed a little bit, searching really for what makes me tick, let me put it like that. And so I started really as a software engineer and was building products, and I always liked building things and creating stuff. But while we were creating really cool products, I always felt a little bit removed from the end customer, right? And the next thing that I did, I ended up consulting software companies instead of building software products, working as a consultant to software companies. And that's how I ended up in sales, because I was sent out to sell our services. And, I never thought of myself as somebody who can be a commercial person, because I was always this like intellectual engineer. And actually, I realized that I was looking at it all wrong. And once I realized that selling is really about understanding the customer, about helping them, I suddenly became a top performer, although I was completely not in sales, but I started selling more than my sales colleague back there. And I realized, well, maybe that's something that I would like to do more. So I've been selling in marketing, B2B tech and services since 2006. I've always kind of like marketing because it's just in the middle between sales, and there's some technology, there's a lot of writing, there's some psychology, all the things that always interest me. So I'm really happy I ended up there. And so, like you mentioned, started several companies and ended up back in 2020 in the middle of the COVID lockdown. Got a call from one of the startup accelerators that I worked with to help out something like 25 companies who were struggling to get leads because it was in the middle of lockdown and all the trade shows and everything was canceled. And I realized, okay, if I really wanted to do this at this scale for all those companies, I needed some help. And of course, the first person I thought of was Andre. That's how we came together. We created a program of 8 weeks, 80 module. It was like a comprehensive program. We took all these startups through, and that's when we realized, okay, we are really working well together, and we wanted to start Full Funnel.
Yeah. That's an interesting transition though, from software engineer to sales. I don't think I've ever heard that before in my entire life, because, well, based on my experience working with software engineers, they want to stay as far away from talking to customers as possible. Like, they don't want any interaction or engagement with customers. They just want to show up for work, do their coding, build whatever they're building, and they're all right in their space doing that. But in terms of that fit early on, I guess you could call it product market fit. How did you really figure that out early on? Was that just based on your sales experience? Was that something you had to learn additionally? How did you figure that out?
What do you mean, like in our company,
Yeah,
reaching
in
the
full
product
funnel.
market fit?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, truth be told, we didn't start from zero. We were both doing consulting individually, and we came together to do, let's say, full funnel B2B marketing for companies, B2B tech companies that have ACVs, annual contract value, anywhere, let's say, between 20, 30K and 500K euros or dollars. And so we've already been working with our own ICPs, if you like, and there was a product market fit. So to be honest, it wasn't that difficult to reach on the one hand. On the other hand, we did change the business model a little bit. So we were, just focusing on giving high impact advice and, consulting instead of doing, previously did some execution as well. So we changed the business model. So there was some iteration on the how to position the product, how to productize our services, how to position also the topic. So there was some searching, but a little bit less than what you would have, let's say, in a B2B SaaS company.
The whole idea or premise of this podcast is educating marketers on how to prove their value at a C-suite level, right? Just at a high level, what are CEOs looking for based on your experience from marketing in terms of business value, and how can marketing demonstrate that value?
Yeah, truth be told, I think there are actually different kinds of CEOs. So let's say ideally, the CEO is looking for revenue contribution. So they're looking for you to help them drive, let's say, inbound revenue, or otherwise impact the revenue, impact maybe, for example, accelerating deals, generating more opportunities, having better clients, landing better opportunities. But really, I think that there are a lot of CEOs, unfortunately, who have the other way to look at marketing. So I know, depending on the industry, depending on the maturity, you will have some CEOs who just believe, okay, you need to get me leads. So this is what the role of marketing is, to drive leads. And we all know that that doesn't work that well, especially if you're into the very more complex, let's say, sales with, higher deal sizes. That kind of approach where you're driving MQLs when there is no sales intent is not really the best way to help the business. And after a while, that may also become clear to the CEO, and then the value of marketing, let's say, in their eye, may go down, although they were the one who are kind of pressuring you to deliver on that KPI. And then there is a third kind of CEOs, just based on my experience, that are kind of disillusioned with marketing. So they had these ideas about what marketing could be doing. They were trying different things. They didn't really do it the right way. And then they actually kind of got disillusioned. They say, okay, marketing really, what it is just to create a bit of awareness, whatever, do a newsletter, organize an event. And the worst thing, that's the worst position to be in, because you become an order taker. You just like basically say, okay, whatever the sales or the executive team needs, materials for the trade show, nice presentation, an event, whatever you need. So that's really the worst position to be in. And ideally, where you want to be at is working with a CEO who understands the value that marketing can create, but also understand that it's not the same as sales. They should understand that it's a long-term gain. They should understand that it's also very important to understand your customers, to define the ICP, to have a good positioning in your market, etc., and understand actually how strategic marketing needs to be in order to deliver on that value.
Right. Those are good responses. I want to focus on the third group mostly, the third CEO that you mentioned, because I would say, probably I'm wrong. But based on my conversation with marketers, most tend to fall within that bracket in terms of working with that type of CEO, where they're order takers, as you mentioned. What do you think they can do? Let's say we're drawing a line in the sand today, and we're looking at the next 90 to 180 days, so 3 to 6 months. what could marketers do to kind of shift the perception of, well, marketing is just the as I interviewed Andrew Smith, and he put it perfectly, the arts and craft department, to shifting that perception to more being, value added and an asset to the organization, more revenue drivers. How what can they do in terms of some tactical tips and strategies to achieve that?
Yeah. Well, the easiest thing that it can do is find a different company. That's going to be probably the easiest step for them. Join a growing team where the CEO has a different mindset, where the team has already proven that, and go from there. But that aside, not a lot of people are able to do that. No, and the reason that I'm saying it simply because sometimes it is going to be very hard to change their mind. Whatever you say, won't have that, let's say, impact, won't have that. They simply won't believe you, right? And there is nothing you can do quickly and like quick and dirty that you can use to prove the value, because like I mentioned, the only way that you can really make an impact is by doing a deep dive, understanding the customers, developing the ICP, and then developing a strategy to sell and market the way that your buyers are buying. Now, having said all of that, let's say that you do get an opportunity, get some space but not a lot, but maybe you somehow, you come up with a good case study, and you somehow get to convince your executive team to give you a chance, to give you a bit of time, bit of budget, not a lot of budget. You don't need a lot. So the first thing that I would do is going back to the basics. I would go and study the CRM to understand what kind of segments are our best fit segments. And then I would try to dive deeper. And by that, I mean like which of them are driving the most revenue, where are the customers staying the longer, spending the most, like LTV, where do we have the best case studies and things like that. Then, of course, also talk about this with sales, get their input on it. And with sales, I would also ask them like practical questions, like, for example, let's look at the 5 fastest deals that you won, or the 5 largest deals, or the 5 largest deals that you lost, and to really dive deeper and try to start to understand, let's say, from the sales perspective, what were the commonalities between those best versus the worst customers, right? So trying to get a picture. Then in the next step, what I would try to do is, if you have the opportunity, sometimes that's really difficult, but if you have the opportunity to go and interview customers, and this is a blocking point that I see in every company that we speak to, like people don't want to do that. And this is really a problem, because if you're not talking to your customers, if you don't have that communication line, just think about the following. I think it's something like 91% of customers who are about to churn are not going to say anything. Right. They're not going to complain proactively. So while a lot of B2B companies companies in general think that customers are satisfied by default and no news is good news, that's not really true. So, to just start talking, having these open communication lines at the worst case scenario is going to help you potentially save churn. But at the same time, you can talk to your customers. Now, maybe, again, you have these account executives or account managers who are very protective of their customers. Everybody in the company considers this to be a no-no. Oh, we don't want to bother them. We don't want to, take their time. So there are other opportunities to talk with your customers. Sometimes if there is a customer event, even if there is a trade show, maybe you don't get to talk to customers, maybe you get to talk to people from the industry, right? To, let's say, people who fit the profile of your potential customer. You are connected to some of them on LinkedIn. You can have some chats with them on LinkedIn, etc. So there are always some opportunities that you can find out to talk to them. And so that would be the next step, to really dive deeper into the way, how you can communicate with your customers. And then, of course, also talk to how they're actually buying a product like yours, who is involved, what is important to them, what are the purchase criteria, what are the objections. And then, of course, if you're talking to your own customer, like why did they choose you over your competitor, what kind of value you're getting, and all of these things. So the vast majority of marketers are going to skip that step. And this is actually, if you look at the vast majority of marketing teams who are underperforming, this is probably the number one reason why they're underperforming. So skip that step at your own peril, I would say, right? So that would be the first step. In the next step, what I would try to do, given that situation that you described, there's not a lot of trust, you're the order taker, you're the arts and crafts, right? So how do you move from there? Provided that you do understand that you have done that basic work, maybe you have a case study that you can use, or maybe you have a possibility to create it, but whatever. I would set up a simple pilot campaign. And by pilot campaign, I mean, I would involve, let's say, 10 accounts. I'm talking about really small number of accounts that are a good fit. And why? Because there's a lot to learn. There is a lot to validate. Also, you are doing this with like a lot of hypotheses. So this really will help you validate those hypotheses. And for example, like I mentioned, if you have somehow refined your positioning for your segment or your value proposition, this is an opportunity to validate that. You're like learning how to maybe, figure out what this account need, how to talk to them, what content to create for them, whatever. You are going to be able again to get, like, the problem with most campaigns, how they're started like with the big upfront, planning, working, and then, a lot of money and time goes into creation of the campaign, and then you launch a campaign, and then you get a binary response. Basically, it's working, it's not working. Unfortunately, if it's set up the way that most campaigns are set up, it's not going to work. And the worst thing is that you're not you won't know why it's not working, and B, you're going to have used up all the goodwill that you have internally. So
Right.
one thing you shouldn't do, you shouldn't go there and lobby, for them to let you do demand generation, let you do ABM or whatever, right? And then, maybe if you manage to get that, then set up such a big campaign. No, try to get some buy-in to set up this pilot. Be very clear about what the goal is. Show, for example, okay, why are you selecting this target segment? Well, show them your analysis that you made of your best target account, well, of your CRM and your best deals. Show them let's say the ICP that you have created and how you've created it based on the work that you've done with sales and speaking to your customers, and show them exactly what you plan to do within that pilot. And also set up expectations straight, because let's just be honest, like, there's no magic hack, there's no magic bullet that will shorten your sales cycle. Well, sales cycle potentially, yes, but buying cycle, let's say the buying process, it is what it is. It is complex. If it's complex, if there are multiple people involved, if you're talking about higher value deals, then definitely you're going to be you have to be very clear about the fact that you won't be able to generate sales. You won't be able to guarantee that you can generate sales opportunities, let's say in a month or two, if your sales cycle is, let's say, 9 months, right? So just be very clear about that. However, what you can do, and what you can do relatively quickly, is you can start having conversations with the right type of buyers in the right type of accounts. You can start having insights, just to be very concrete. For example, when I did a campaign like that on my own, as at the very beginning when we started, I spoke to a bunch of CEOs, and for example, for one of them, I just figured out that, it was the same time, so no trade shows, right? So I just figured out that, like, 80% of their business was coming through trade shows. And when I asked them, okay, so what is your plan to deal with that? And he said, well, you know what? We are actually creating an inbound marketing strategy. We're basically creating an online marketing strategy right now and looking to figure that out. So like having that information for me, about a target account, it's like I know that they're in the market right now. I know exactly how to position our services because they told me. So going back to that pilot campaign, I would focus that pilot campaign on generating those conversations, validating your, let's say, hypothesis, and also starting to get this key insight about those target accounts. And very often actually it does happen that there is either a, let's say, potential opportunity, an opportunity that will develop within the next couple of months. And so this is completely different. Like we are now starting to talk about, potential deals of whatever the deal size is versus, I don't know how many people have opened your email or, clicks or whatever, visits, or even MQLs that never convert to actual sales opportunity. It's like we're talking about very different things. And I believe that even in a small pilot campaign, you can build enough credibility to at least get a yes to keep on doing that, and until you start really generating some revenue results from that as well.
Right. Excellent breakdown. I love that. You mentioned two things, which just now in terms of that revenue generation at the end of the pilot program, hopefully. And you also mentioned in terms of companies with long sales cycles, like 9 months, for example. But more than likely, throughout that entire process, that pilot program, the CEO is going to want to see some sort of indication that this is actually working. So outside of revenue or even sales opportunities, because that might take a while to be generated, what other indicators, KPIs, metrics can they track during the early stages of that pilot program to really show that this is something that's viable and worth, potentially it will be successful, hopefully?
Absolutely. No, this is a great question. And I have a kind of a twofold answer to that. So I think just speaking directly to the question about metrics, there is a number of things that you can be tracking, and really it is about how much you're engaging those accounts, those target accounts, how many buyers you're actually engaging, what they call account penetration. You can really be looking at different things. So for example, you can be looking at the visits of those accounts on your website, looking at the key pages. Suddenly, like accounts who were previously not aware of what you're doing are potentially like checking you out. And what I always advise at the beginning is to really focus on generating buyer conversations, so real conversation, even though there may not be sales conversations with buyers, because that's another very good metric to track. For example, I don't know, I'll give you a concrete example. So with a client, we ran a pilot exactly like that, and within something like, from, let's say, the actual start of the campaign, of the pilot campaign, I think after 2 or 3 weeks, they actually booked calls with 11 out of 30 target accounts. And with, in some cases, multiple buyers, in some cases, one buyer. And in every case, they learned an amazing amount of like insight. And of course, conversations went into the right direction. And, some of those actually turned into an opportunity. But even without that, I'm sure that if you get this level of conversation, and you can involve sales at that time, and sales is going there, and, after maybe having tried to reach out, I don't know, to 100 companies and having whatever 2 or 3% response rate, and maybe booking a call or not, right? Suddenly, with targeting 10, 15 accounts, having conversation with 30% of them, relevant conversation about, what kind of solution, what kind of challenges are they having right now as it relates to your product, what kind of priorities do they have, what are they using right now, is that like, are they happy with that, all of these things that you want to know. And realizing that, okay, sometimes you may be lucky, right, and you may be at the right time, and sometimes you may, realize that, okay, this is something that may become an opportunity within another year or so, which is also something you want to know. Now,
Right.
I said it's a twofold answer, and I said you might be lucky, and there are things, and that's the second part of the answer, is there are things you can do to stack the odds in your favor. And what is that? Well, it's looking at, just to use a precise term, a first party intent data, which really just means data that you own about your target accounts. So what could that be? If you have, and there's now free tools, I believe like Clearbit has the weekly report. There are other tools with, even just with the free version, if you can install that on your website, you can start seeing which accounts are visiting your website, which pages they're visiting, how long they're spending on there. Just that would be a simple one, right? To start understanding, okay, there may be some interest. Like, imagine just if somebody from whatever example company, example target account, they spent like 2 hours, they check the key product pages, they check the pricing page, for example. Well, that's certainly an indication that's a signal of intent, that they're definitely, so picking those accounts, installing that's probably the easiest thing you can do, and it's free. But also looking at, other stuff. You do have maybe some MQLs, maybe some of them are actually engaging, beyond the download or, joining that webinar. Maybe some of them have joined multiple webinars, but you still weren't able to activate them. Well, perhaps, when you dive deeper and you contact those buyers one by one, you might be able to activate. So this could be another way to kind of like get the intent. And the third way would be to also simply look at your pipeline, and maybe you had contacts with companies previously, but the deal was kind of stalled. They kind of stopped responding. Maybe they are just like, in a different stage. They may be just waiting for a new person to join. Who knows what is happening? But you might also include those, let's say, stalled or frozen deals from your pipeline into your target accounts. And often this is more difficult depending on the structure of the company. This is more difficult to pull off. But I think probably the biggest opportunities in many companies is existing accounts, and this is just so. Sometimes, like for example, we've been speaking to a company, and they have they want to target more, they want to focus more on the enterprise segment, as they call it, and they have also like a self-service free trial. Well, not just free trial, but people can also purchase the product, and they actually have a lot of accounts who only have a few licenses, right? So
Right.
they're existing accounts and they only have a few licenses. Well, I would definitely want to speak to those people, understand the use case and why basically they are not buying more, where we know that they would have much more value if they would involve other people, etc., etc. So just a couple examples how to stack the odds in your favor.
All right. Awesome. I might have two questions because I know someone is going to be listening to this and is going to ask these two questions in their mind. First of all, you mentioned Clearbit. Which other intent data software do you recommend or is out there that you're aware of? That's good.
Yeah. So basically, like I mentioned, the best intent data, let's say, is your own, right? As they call it, the first party. And why is that? Because people buy from people they know, like, and trust, right? So if there is already the awareness, if they know who you are, if they know how you're different and worth buying, the chance of them being interested is going to be much, it's going to be so much easier for you to activate them. The problem with, and there are other kinds of like intent data. There's the so-called second party and third party. Second party, for example, G2. G2 is a directory of SaaS companies, SaaS products, and they know who is searching for what kind of solution. And they can sell you this data. Well, they are selling this data, right? You can buy this data from them. And this is really cool. Of course, you should know that, of course, two things will happen. Other people will have, other companies, your competitors will have access to the same data. And then second, important to kind of mention this, because if you are just coming into their consideration set or on their radar after a long process, almost at the end, right, when they're actually buying,
Right.
you may be too late to the table, right? You may be just getting too late to the table, because especially for larger deals, for smaller deals, you may win a smaller deal like that for sure. And you may say, okay, my system is actually working, but my strategy is working, my approach is working. But really what you should be focusing on is on those larger deals. And those larger deals, if your competitors have been, in conversation with those buyers and influencing the buying committee over the last 6 months or whatever, you're going to have a much harder time closing those deals, which you can get based on intent data, or even just like capturing demand via search or other intent, higher intent channels. So that would be G2. So they can give you data about, who is looking for a category, who is maybe even looking at your solution or your direct competitors, this kind of information. And then there are like third party, like Bambora, for example, is an example of a third party, which basically aggregates. They have partnerships with a lot of websites. And again, they know what kind of information people are looking on those websites. So it's like third party because they aggregated the information for you. But pay attention, intent data, start with your own. That's, I believe, where you will make the most chance. But it also means that you might have to, that only works if you're doing some sort of demand gen, some sort of awareness creation. Otherwise, you're going to have a very limited number of accounts who are actually, for example, visiting your website, engaging with your brand in other ways.
Right. And let me ask a question, since you brought it up. So what you just mentioned is in terms of that brand awareness. So how can marketers actually translate that brand awareness into sales opportunities? I mean, I'm almost sure you touched on it somewhere in your response, but if you have something like a more direct response for that question.
No,
Because
absolutely.
yeah.
It's a great question. I mean, let's just also be clear what is brand awareness, like in this context, like just to nail it. I think it's important. I think it's simply, so you want your, I mean, you want your target buyers, so not just anybody, you want your target buyers to be aware of how you can help them, really, how you're different and worth buying. So it's not just enough for them to be aware of the brand, but really like, okay, aware of the value proposition, in other words, right? So just to kind of like nail that. And what are you all about? Like, how are you relevant to them? Now, how do you turn that? Well, I think the missing piece very often is demand generation. And people want, I mean, again, it depends how they got to know you. Are they in the buying process? If they're in the buying process, they're considering a solution, they discovered you and you're in the consideration set. Okay, that's a different story. I assume you're not asking about that case. I assume you're asking about a case where they're not actively buying, they're aware of you as a player in that category, a player in that market. So basically, you have only two choices. You can try to generate the demand. How do you generate the demand? Very simply, by showing the solution and how the solution can help them. I mean, to put it very simply. And that doesn't mean sending everybody to cold audience, well, even brand aware audience, to a landing page and asking to book a demo. but really making them aware, for example, through case studies, right? Just as an example, like educating them about, okay, so what are the other people who are in a role like yours? And I'm not talking about those typical 2-page case studies that actually just like each case study looks like the other one, and
Right.
that's not very credible. But really like helping the buyer understand, really like picture, okay, if we've done this, so first of all, what does it take to do this? What are the concrete results that we could expect? Who would have to be involved? Like really getting the whole picture. And of course, understanding the benefits of implementing that solution, and all of that. So and demand, it may take some time to generate that demand, and drive it. And again, even if you have generated it, maybe it's still not the right time. And so the second part of the answer is, you have to have some sort of an always on nurturing program in place. And I know it sounds like a mouthful, and what is that, and is this like email sequences? What I really simply mean is just consistently, frequently being where your buyers are, and sharing sharing really content that solves that problem, that tells stories about people who are like them, or companies who are like them. In other words, like client stories, showing your basically expertise and credibility, and being there. And from time to time, when the time is right, they may re-engage if the time wasn't right there. And so the demand generation may take some time, and usually it does. If we just look at our own pipeline, the majority of let me put it under quotes for people who are listening, there are sales ready leads, but if you really look at their journey, as far as we can tell, most of them have been engaged with us for at least 6 months.
Right.
They've been, some of their colleagues may be in our community, others may be on our newsletter, some of them may be, listening to a webinar, etc. So that's because we have these activities all the time, and that's how you kind of nurture your target market.
Yeah. And just a follow up to that from the demand generation aspect, how would you recommend aligning marketing and sales to work together on that? Because yes, there's a marketing aspect early on in terms of that branding aspect, and that always on nurturing, as you say. But how about that alignment to really get sales involved in the entire process? Because these won't close because marketing is always nurturing and always putting content out there, if that's what we're using.
Okay, so I mean, there is definitely, I think marketing can definitely drive inbound revenue. They can drive inbound opportunities. Absolutely. Marketing can also capture demand with things like search, high intent channels, and maybe demand they have generated. But you asked very good questions, by the way, Mr. And this is a really, really important one, because actually, if that's all you do, you're leaving a lot of money on the table. And what I
Right.
mean by that is that you asked concrete questions. So let me answer it concretely. How can you align? Well, first of all, you need to align on the target market. That's the most important thing. Like,
Mhm.
we should be looking at the same segments. We should be, even at a certain moment, looking at the same accounts if you're doing something account based. And it's just amazing how many companies just miss that probably most important thing. We should also be aligned somehow on the value proposition for those. But all of that aside, very concretely, how can sales evolve? Well, what happens is that as you are nurturing, as you're creating that content, and I'm talking about, let's take a very concrete example. Let's say LinkedIn. I'm not talking about dropping links to your blog. I'm talking about creating content for native consumption, or basically just LinkedIn posts, native LinkedIn posts, or whatever other social or communities you might be using. And so you are where your buyers are, and you're creating content they can consume there. They don't have to click somewhere and go. No, they can consume it there. That's how you're actually nurturing them and driving the demand. But then what happens is some of them will engage. Some of them will engage, and that's not buying intent. Somebody liking your LinkedIn post is definitely not the buying intent, or commenting or whatever. But after a while, people are engaging. You can turn that engagement into a conversation, and that's usually what sales is really good at. So if you're working with sales and helping them, for example, with content so that they can stand out on LinkedIn and not just be the yet another vendor, like sending these cold like messages like everybody else and never getting any responses. What you can be doing is by sharing content, and you will be creating engagement triggers. And why do I call them triggers? Because you can actually use them as triggers to start conversation. And people, I think this is the best kept secret. It's like, it's you normally, I mean, if you do it right, and it's no rocket science, if you're reaching out to people to start a non-sales conversations at the beginning, it's a non-sales conversation, you can have response rates of more than 50%. So we are not talking anymore about a couple of percent that you have on cold outreach, or maybe even under 1%, which a lot of people unfortunately have. I'm talking about like more than half of people that you're actually reaching out to will engage with you in a conversation. Two problems with that, if you don't do it right and you just treat, like I mentioned, like them joining a webinar, whatever it is, as a buying intent and immediately trying to book the demo, no, that won't work, of course, right? This is like meeting somebody for the first time, let's say in a bar or on an event or wherever, on a wedding, doesn't really matter, and asking their hand in marriage, right? It just like, of course, doesn't make sense. So what you're doing is like the appropriate action. So you may just thank them for whatever their engagement. You may try to ask them questions about whatever I posted about ABM, and I can ask them about is this something that are implement? Do they have an ABM motion, or what are the priorities? We can start conversations about that. And another thing, if they're not engaging, well, they may be engaging, you have a conversation, may fizzle out, but that's another part of the piece of the puzzle, is knowing that you don't have to close it right away. You have just, there was this touch point, there was this conversation, you may have learned something, there was a kind of a beginning of the relationship built there, and there will always be new, so they are a bit closer, there is more brand awareness, there is more also personal brand awareness, etc. So they're much more likely to engage with your future content, or you may get them in another way at a later stage with a different initiative. You may, I don't know, invite them to be a guest on your podcast, or invite them to an event that you're organizing, or whatever other thing that you're going to launch from within your marketing to start a conversation again. And so sales can be involved very much in that process, and needs to be involved actually for it to work.
Yeah, awesome. And I love that the first thing you mentioned was marketing and sales should align on the ICP. And here's why I say that, because something happened to me last week where someone from a B2B tech company, I think they offer data security and cloud hosting services. So that person reached out to me cold on LinkedIn. I read the message initially, didn't respond at the time, but later on I decided to respond when they reached out again. And I said to the person, hey, based on what you're selling, I don't think I'm the right person or the right fit for what you're offering. And I led with that conversation, and the person responded to say, hey, Winston, thanks for letting me know. Actually, we're using a third party, service or provider to do LinkedIn outreach for us. And it just shows a clear example of how you can end up wasting a lot of money trying to reach out to the wrong person, because, well, I don't know their business model, but probably it's a case where they're charging per number of outreaches. So probably every 1,000 they charge a set number, and that's why you have to be very careful. Whether you're a CEO, you're a marketer, be very specific about your ICP, which is something I learned from you guys in terms of disqualification criteria and why that's so important. Very good stuff.
All right. No, I mean, it's it's where it all starts, like right with the ICP and what kind of companies are good companies, because the worst thing you can have is to put all that work and maybe generate whatever a call or an opportunity, only to hear from sales, well, that wasn't really a good fit, that's not really the right match, your leads are not good, whatever they say. And so then, I mean, you really want to make sure that those those buyers that you are generating one way or another, that you are engaging, are at least, that's the minimum, the right type of buyers.
Yeah, yeah. And you also mentioned something, because if those accounts aren't the right fit, then it completely defeats the purpose of what we're trying to accomplish based on this conversation, which is how can marketers prove their value and get that buying. So
Mm,
if you're passing leads to sales and it's not a fit, then you're only hurting more than helping your case at the
mm,
end of the day.
absolutely, absolutely.
So, Vlad, the final question I have before I allow you to go is, I saw a post and I said I have to ask Vlad about this post that he made, where you mentioned about the LinkedIn formula and post template. But how you actually structured it was how to get buying from external buyers, right? If you're reaching out to them. But what I want to know is, how can marketers, well, first of all, tell us what the LinkedIn format and post template is so people know what we're talking about. But also, secondly, how can marketers use that probably very same approach and template to get internal buying for even the pilot program that you mentioned earlier?
All right. So let's go back to the start. You mentioned the formula, quote unquote. It's a very simple thing, right? We marketers sometimes like to speak of formulas. Basically, what it says is that the way you can be writing LinkedIn posts that attract the attention of your buyers is to first pick a topic you want to write about, and a lot goes into that. I'll come back to that in a moment. And then you pick a post type, and then you start writing. So what am I talking about here? So first of all, the big problem that a lot of companies have is that they write content that nobody reads,
Right.
and they write irrelevant content or maybe superficial content. So the first thing you want to make sure is that you're writing on the topics that are relevant to your buyer. So how can marketing help sales? How can marketing, make sure that their content is actually going to make an impact? Well, by creating what we call a map of informational needs. And it's just a name we gave to document where you collect all the topics, subtopics, and questions that your buyers have. And I'm not talking about, coming up with personas like try hard Tammy, or, the Mary marketer Mary, whatever. I'm talking about real people, real buyers, and, coming up with what kind of questions do they have during sales calls, what kind of questions that are they asking maybe in your forums, when they contact you. Looking at also just simply doing online research, figuring out who they follow, who's, what kind of common content do they like, then looking up those influencers, those industry influencers, seeing what kind of questions are they getting on their content, looking at the target communities, figuring out what questions are being asked, etc. So the key here is to come up with topics that your buyers are genuinely interested in. So let's say that, we are now talking about marketing, and our audience is probably interested in a topic of, how can you use LinkedIn to, uh, I don't know, create brand awareness, or how can you use LinkedIn to create six-figure opportunities? Let me put it like that. Well, that's definitely an interesting topic. We know that. So So the key is to select the topic or just select a question that people have. And the question may be, speaking about LinkedIn, is how can I cut through all the noise? There's so many other people sending messages to my buyers. This is an actual insight from one of our surveys. I remember somebody said, everybody else is doing the same as me. They're all sending the same messages, and that's why it's so hard. Like in my market, they say, as if it's not in every market. In my market, they say there are just so many like competitors, and they're all just flooding the inbox of my buyers. Well, that is actually a question that a lot of salespeople at least have, and some marketers as well. And so that can be the topic of the post. And so the next step is to select a post type. And what do I mean by that? Well, after a while, we figured out that there are some types of posts that work better for our audience, and everybody's audience is a little bit different. But for example, one post type that works really, really well is a how to, as the most simple one, right? How do you do X? So, for example, how do I get my busy decision? How do I cut through the noise and get my busy decision makers to respond to my messages on LinkedIn? Okay, sounds already interesting. What we also like to make it even more concrete for people, to make it even more practical, is to say, okay, 5 steps to get your buyers to respond to your messages. People like steps, so this is a post type. I could have attacked this completely differently. I could have written about the biggest mistakes that people make. Here are 5 mistakes that people make, here are the 5 mistakes that end up with their messages, with the LinkedIn messages being ignored. I cannot think of a nice sentence, but I hope you get what I'm trying to say. Yeah. So this would be a completely different type of post. Or, for example, it can be a third type of post that, and I'll stop there, could be the villain post, or where you're like attacking, let's say, a common thing, something that you really disagree. Let's say challenging the status quo, or let's say you're attacking, in this case, the cold outreach, the unthoughtful, generic mass cold outreach. This is a villain that we very often attack. So you could be talking about that and all the bad things that happen when you do that and whatever, right? So that helps, because instead of thinking every time about what you should be writing and maybe coming up with some ideas that are not relevant for buyers, you always start from the one, let's say, the topics and the questions that your buyers actually are interested in. And 2, you're also leveraging, let's say, every platform is different. Like LinkedIn is different than YouTube, is different than Facebook, is different than whatever. And so by leveraging the types of posts that work well on LinkedIn, you're again stacking the odds in your favor. And you're also not wasting time, again, imagining something yourself and trying to write. You're just applying a formula. Why are these formulas important? Well, they're important because they allow you to do things efficiently. And if you are not doing things efficiently, you will never be able to do them consistently. And if you're not doing them consistently, the whole thing will not work. What people expect is doing a bit of an activity, posting on LinkedIn, whatever, connecting to people, and then expecting some sort of a linear result, right? Okay, I'm going to post 5 posts and I'm going to get whatever 3 opportunities. Well, that's not how it works. Unfortunately, it takes some time and patience to be consistent before the results start coming in. There is a learning curve. You need to build that trust and authority. Like, people need to start trusting you. It takes time before they start associating you with that. So, and for that, you need to be consistent. You cannot be consistent if you don't have a process. And so this is a simple process that I always advise people to follow. And how can they get the second part of your question? How can they get the buy-in? Well, the best way to get your buy-in, if you're talking about very concretely LinkedIn, is basically do it yourself first. That's the easiest. Lead by example. I mean, you can try to set up a program and educate and how do they say recruit or appoint internal champions or whatever.
Right.
But if you can do it on a small scope, if you can do it yourself and maybe with one more colleague, and you can prove that you're starting to get good results, again going back to my original story about a pilot, and starting to get results, it's going to be so much easier for you to actually get other people on board.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So Vlad, we've come to the end of our conversation. Before you go, is there any like final thought, probably something we didn't cover, a question I didn't ask, just around the whole theme of how to get that C-suite wine that you'd love to leave the listeners and viewers with?
Yeah, I think I have two things. Think of the basics always first. Don't skip the basics. There is no magic bullet, silver bullet, hack, tactic, channel that is going to open the flood gate of leads, right? So it comes down to solid execution of fundamentals, of understanding who the customers are, on focusing on the best customers, and going first slow, learning first to walk in a pilot before you run. And another maybe tip is do what Winston is doing. He's doing a great job in simply connecting with people from his industry, and I'm sure that he learns a ton. He gets connected to great people who can connect into other people. So this is probably the easiest way for you to start learning about the industry, learning about customers, learning about start to build also your own maybe personal brand or your own brand, and connecting to people. I remember like the first time I did it, um, I sent invites to 11 accounts to appear on my podcast, and I had 8 of them say yes. So it's almost, I said there is no magic bullets, but it's almost like you know, it's almost like magic. It works really well. Of course, that doesn't mean that these will be sales, but it's just an amazing tool to use. Connect to people, go out and talk to them. Whether it's a podcast or events, it doesn't really matter. You're in 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, you're going to be at a different place.
Yeah, awesome. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we close out this episode. Vlad, if people need to reach you, connect with you, where can they find you?
I think the best way to find me is on LinkedIn, where I post daily. I'm sure you'll include the link in the podcast description, so people can just go. Let me know if you heard, if you got to know me through this episode. I would love to then be able to go back and tell this to Winston, who was so kind to invite me here. And, we can always chat. I will respond to every message, unless it's just a generic cold email that is not relevant to me. But otherwise, definitely reach out if you have any questions.
Awesome. Vlad, thanks again for being on. It was an excellent conversation. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
No, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it myself too.
This has been the Revenue Alignment Podcast. Join us next week where we have more amazing content to help you demonstrate, communicate, and prove your value at the C-suite level. I'm Winston, your host, and this is a wrap.